So the question I wanted to start with today, this is kind of a silly question. I'll just tell you that up front. Have you ever done something you knew wasn't good for you? Wow, really? So I'm in front of the group of 30 saints that exist in this world, is what you're saying. Oh, all the way, absolutely. I preach that every week, man. I'm a mess. Yeah, right? I mean, we all do things that aren't good for us, right? Because we kind of this short-term thing, like, well, just the night, or just the day, or just this weekend, or just this next 10 years, sort of thing. Because that's something that can kind of happen, right? Is that we kind of say, I'm just going to do this a little bit. I'm a little stressed, so I'll have a drink. I'm so happy, I'll have a drink. Everything's going so well, I'll have a drink. Everything's so bad, I'll have a drink. And sometimes we start to lean on those sorts of things, right? And it's not just drinking; it can be any number of things. It can just be bad habits. It could just be not eating well, right? We live in a time where we all know the damage of not eating well. But what's one more sleeve of Oreos? How much is that going to hurt, right? And one more box of Oreos, and sort of thing. And it's the BJ's box, or the Costco box of Oreos, right? The thing is, the kind of point I want to make in all that is that, we all do things sometimes that are inconsistent with the life that we say we want to lead. But there are challenges that rise up when we consistently do things that are inconsistent with the life that we want to lead. Right? Eventually, that is going to impact us. It's going to keep us from living the life that we want to. Right? So what I wanted to do today as we continue this series we've been in, What's Got Your Attention, is kind of talk a bit about kind of the daily practices in our lives. Now remember that the point of this series is just kind of looking at the priorities that we set in our lives. Right? That we've talked a lot about how these priorities affect us. Because if you remember back to the first week, I kind of kicked off with this idea that we often find ourselves struggling to get through life. Right? I just got to get to the end of the day. I just got to get to the weekend. I just got to get to my next vacation. I just got to get through the semester. I got to get to retirement. Got to get through this illness. And we find ourselves in life just trying to get through, or at a minimum, even if we're not trying to get through, life just becomes drudgery. What are you doing today? Same thing I did yesterday. The infamous, and I'm going to modify this for church, same stuff, different day. Right? And the thing is, life ends up like that. But as we looked at the first week, Jesus seemed to indicate that life didn't have to be like that. Jesus makes this statement: I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And how many of us feel like we're having a life that is really full? And remember that when we dug into what Jesus said there, his point was actually even deeper than it looks like to us. Because remembering that the original language of that statement was ancient Greek, and ancient Greek has multiple words for life. And when Jesus said, I have come that they may have life, he used a very particular Greek word, zoe. And zoe is a divine life, a life handed down by God, a life that is rich and full and complete and satisfying, a life that can begin now but carry on into eternity. And Jesus said, I've come that you may have that kind of life. And so the question is, do we feel like we're living that kind of life? Back to your question, I often have periods where I don't feel like I'm living that kind of life. I have same stuff, different days in my life. Right? I have times where, I'm just trying to get through to the next break. Right? Because we kind of get into these kind of places in our life where we're just not really focused on living that way. Throughout the series, we've talked about a few different things. The first week we talked about this idea that we all probably, most likely all of us want to have a full life, but we often look to the wrong things to provide it. That if I just focus on getting enough money, then everything will be wonderful. If I just work hard enough, everything will just be wonderful. If people see me as successful, well, then everything will be wonderful. And we put our hopes in the wrong things, right? Not that any of those things are bad, but they have a specific place in our lives. They're not the ultimate thing in our lives. And then last week we talked about this issue that I think a lot of us struggle to make a priority. And that is the idea of actually being present in our lives. Actually being where you are while you're there. And being conscious of those times. And what I want to look at today, kind of building on those things, is the importance of our daily habits and behaviors. Because our daily practices are fundamental to the life we live. Because somehow we tend to sometimes look at the fact that we see that we have a life and we see that we have days. And it never occurs to us that our life is just a series of days. That we somehow see each day different. But if I don't do things today that are consistent with the life I want to live, and I do that for enough days, what life did I live? Something inconsistent with what I say I want to live, what I'm hoping for. And I'm finding myself, without intending to, just not being consistent with that life. And I think, we all know that, right? I could talk about the fact that we break out of being consistent with the things that we want, and when we don't follow through on the things we really want to do, and we can all nod and agree and walk out of here and change nothing. So I thought I would use an example that I think makes the issue pretty clear, in my opinion, if I have a very high opinion of my own examples, by the way. I want you to imagine, I'm going to ask you to imagine, that you have a friend who wants to be an Olympic athlete. Right, the Olympics were a few weeks ago, so I thought I'd use a topical example. Look at me go, right? So you have a friend who wants to be an Olympiad. And they tell you that, man, this is the most important thing in my life. Man, my sport is everything to me, that I'm going to not just qualify for the Olympics, but I'm going to go there, I'm going to win a medal, and I think I have a real shot at winning the gold medal. But you sit down with them at lunch, and you notice their lunch is a pack of potato chips and a package of cookies. And day after day, they're eating chips and cookies and drinking sodas and all those sort of things. And it's like, well, that doesn't really seem like the diet of an athlete. And you notice that you get texts and emails from them at all hours of the night. 11 o'clock at night, 3 in the morning, 2 in the morning. And you're like, wow, they're really not seem to be getting a lot of sleep. In fact, they're always texting me about the movie they're watching at 2 o'clock in the morning. So they're not really resting like an athlete. And they ask you to meet them after the workout, but you head out to the gym and you realize they didn't come to the gym today. In fact, you notice they don't go to the gym very often at all, and they don't really seem to practice their sport very much. So finally, the day of the Olympic trials show up, and they get there, and they're all ready, and they're on the starting block, so to speak. And they don't qualify. And they walk up to you going, I can't believe it. I poured my life into this. This is the most important thing to me. This whole thing is rigged. The Olympic Committee, it's all political anyway. It's who you know. Is that really the case? I mean, if we had an honest relationship with that person, we might be able to sit down with them and say, well, I know you say your sport is important to you, but your actions weren't consistent with that. The way you lived your life day after day, no matter how important you say that sport is, was not consistent to being the person you could have been in that sport, right? Even if this person did not have the ability and the natural talent in order to be an Olympiad, they certainly could have done far better than they did if they would have actually applied themselves day after day in a manner consistent with achieving that. That basically, we often go through our lives doing things that are inconsistent with our goals. And what we have to do is choose to be disciplined, right? That's what we would say to the athlete, man, you got to be disciplined. You got to eat right. You got to rest. You got to work out. You got to practice. Yeah, there'll be some days that maybe you just don't feel like it today. But I mean, if you've ever, worked out consistently, how many times when you get to the gym, you don't feel like working out? But after you do it, you're so glad you did. Well, maybe that applies to other parts of our life as well. Maybe it applies to our relationship with Jesus. Because maybe if we could learn to be a bit more disciplined in our practices, and please understand, I'm not finger wagging at you. Right? I'm just encouraging you to consider that maybe some daily disciplined practices could begin to help deepen our connection with God and maybe move us a bit closer to that kind of life that Jesus is describing, that kind of rich, divine, full version of life. And it's interesting is that the Apostle Paul actually writes about this idea. And interestingly, he actually uses a sports analogy to make his point. It's not even a joke, because we always think about sports in terms of the time we live in, but sports have been a big deal for a really long time. Right? And in the first century, sports like running, track, were really popular. Things like boxing were really popular. And so there were people who were fans of these sports. So just like we use sports analogies now to make a point, Paul does the same thing. Paul compares living well to being an athlete. He says, well, all athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away. But we do it for an eternal prize. Paul says you need to think like an athlete. That I need to think like an athlete. Right? Athletes are successful in their pursuit because they are disciplined. And he's making the point, and look what they're running for. They're running for effectively a trophy, something that will go away. Right? Jesus is extending to us something much richer than that, a full life, a meaningful life, a life that carries on into eternity. But we don't just wait for eternity. We can live in something full right now. And Paul's saying that if we want to have that, we want to be disciplined. He goes on to say, this is his personal practices. So I run with purpose in every step. I'm not just shadow boxing. I'm not just going through the motions. I'm not just showing up at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning saying, praise the Lord, leaving at 11 and forget everything that happened, just to show up on Sunday again next week. I'm actually doing what Jesus said, right? This is what he's telling us, that he lives his life with purpose, recognizing that we all have a purpose, right? That we all can engage with that kind of life like Jesus tells us about. And then he also talks about this idea of kind of living it out, right? Running with purpose and being disciplined in our training, right? So what does it mean to live that way, with running with purpose and being disciplined in our training? Right? Well, the way I think of it is that the life of being a Jesus follower is kind of both being in the race and training for it at the same time. And what I mean by that is that Jesus gives us a clear example of how to live, of how to treat people, how to interact with people, right? Knowing that we can never meet the standard that he had, but he shows us what it's like to be loving towards people and what it means to be that way. But what about the training part? What does training look like? And I think that a big part of that is actually choosing to deepen our connection with Jesus, to actually have practices in our life that bring these things together. And part of that is being here together on a Sunday morning. I always joke that all people do is come to church on Sunday, never change, and kind of come back next week. I'm glad you're here, right? Be clear about that, right? I do believe that coming and worshiping together is a big deal. It really, really matters. There's something about being in the presence of God with other people who are seeking God that deepens our connections and opens our hearts and opens our minds. So that is really, really important. But I think there are other things that we can do throughout the week that deepen that connection. And part of it really builds on what we talked about last week, this idea of being present, right? And one of the things I talked about last week was this idea of actually being consciously present, right? I encourage us to kind of, throughout the week, to take a few minutes to actually be quiet and present. I said you kind of do it any time of day that works for you, but I think start of the day is generally the best for most of us, right? To actually sit down and be quiet for just a few minutes, right? Be consciously present, right? To actually, just kind of ideally take a walk outside if you can, but at least kind of look out your window and notice what you see and notice what you hear and kind of take in the fragrances and actually just be there present in God's creation. And that is a great starting point. But what I would like to encourage you to do is go another step further with that practice. That before you actually take that time to just be quiet, to actually read something either from the Bible itself or from a devotional, right? I know so many people like the Daily Bread as something you can do. We've got the YouVersion Bible app where you can get these really short reading plans. You can go through like really short, just like 2 or 3 minutes sort of thing. Read one of those things and then say a brief prayer, right? So read it and say a brief prayer and just ask God to give you understanding and clarity and help you to see what he wants you to see in it. And then after that, do that practice of being present just like we talked about last week. All right, so you read briefly, pray briefly, and now be quiet and be present in God's creation, having started with a conscious connection with God. And if you do that day after day, and I'm talking about a total time investment of like 10, 15 minutes on the high end, you'll start to notice an awareness develop. You'll start to notice that your understanding begins to grow. And what we're doing here is that we're making a regular habit of being conscious, not just conscious with ourselves, which is really important, but also having a conscious connection to God and that relationship with God and actually thinking about that. But by being present in God's creation with God's word in your mind and heart, it just begins to just connect you in a different way. And of course, we continue to do the sort of things we talked about last week about being present with our friends and with our family, and being present with one another while we're here. And I can't guarantee you, but my bet would be is inside of 2 weeks, probably inside of a week, but inside of 2 weeks, you would start to get a greater sense of that life like Jesus describes, where you become more settled, more joyful. Maybe you become a little bit more aware of the good things and a little bit less aware of the ugly things. Maybe a bit more peaceful. How different would your life be if you were just a bit more peaceful? Not running around angry all the time. Not running around in fear all the time. Not afraid of them all the time. But just present. Just present where you are, doing what you can do in the time and place that you're in. I truly believe it would change everything for us. And I think that developing our training goes even further. And it's kind of interesting that, just as the Apostle Paul uses this analogy of running in sports to make his point, the author of another New Testament book, the book of Hebrews, makes a similar point. And again, this author uses this idea of running to make the point. This author says, let us strip off every weight that slows us down. Let's strip off every weight that slows us down. And one of the things that's kind of important to understand is that in the first century, runners were obsessed with weight. That they believed that anything extra they carried would actually make them run slower, which is reasonable. But do you know how obsessed first century runners in that part of the world were with weight? In competition, they ran naked. Let it all hang out, baby. Right? Here we go. Right? But and so what the author here is doing is that, just like we would make a sports analogy, he's just tapping into what everyone knew. That runners believed that getting rid of the excess weight helped them run faster. So the question is what excess weight are we carrying around? What's got a hold of us? What's slowing us down? What would help us feel a little bit lighter? And the things that I think about for all of us is that what are you carrying from your past that's slowing you down? What are those painful things, those crushing memories, those emotional hurts that you've never really quite healed from? What about a toxic or abusive relationship that you were part of that you've never really gotten over or healed from or support for? Childhood trauma, and childhood trauma sticks like few other traumas do that we've never really broken away from. Or maybe you're not even sure what's actually holding on to you, but what you do know is that you feel angry all the time, or fearful all the time, or unseen, or unimportant, or forgotten, or unimportant, and no one seems to care. Does it feel like that to you? I will tell you that's not true, but does it feel like that to you? And we keep trying to convince ourselves that, no, I'm okay, because, if I push it down hard enough, it goes away, right? If I run fast enough, I'll outrun it. But we don't outrun it. It sticks with us. And at the worst possible time, it will crop up. And we're not living that life like Jesus describes because we're just trying to survive again. We're just trying to push it down. We're just trying to outrun it. We're just hoping it doesn't blow up at the wrong time. So if we don't deal with those sort of things, they're going to slow us down. We're not going to live that life. And as the author of Hebrews continues and talks about kind of getting rid of this weight, right, stripping off of the weight that slows us down, he then makes another point. He says, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And now it's like, oh man, now we got to do the sin thing, right? Now what list does Jim use for sin, right? Because that's what it is, right? It's some list, right? It's in the back of some book. But when we talk about sin, like what does that mean? I mean, is there a list somewhere? Where is that list, out of curiosity? Is it the 10 Commandments? Jesus didn't seem to define it as a list. Jesus tells us that sin is a result. Anything we do that harms ourselves or someone else is sin. And this is a point that the Apostle Paul makes incredibly well in a number of his writings, where he just talks about the fact is how what you do impacts a person. Well, that's sin. So what Jesus did to make things clear for us is he gave us a really clear instruction. He said, love others as I have loved you. And how did Jesus love people? How did he love us? Right? He gave everything for our benefit. He lifted people up. When people were weak and in need, he strengthened them. When people were on paths that were harmful to them, he redirected them. He supported people. He cared for people. So the measure is, are we loving like Jesus loved? Understanding that none of us can ever get that 100%. He's the only one that nails it, but that doesn't mean we don't try, right? And what does it mean to harm someone? I mean, sure, we could be openly aggressive to someone, and that would be harmful. But what if we're just dismissive of someone? What if we're judgmental of someone because they're different than us? Well, that sounds like it's harmful. So that would be sin. And so those things get a hold of us, and they hold us back, and they hold us down. And how about how we treat ourselves? Do you ever call yourself stupid? Do you ever have that voice that just plays inside telling you how worthless you are? Is there anything you struggle with to be free of? Something that you thought was going to help you has now got a control over you. See, the thing is that Jesus warned us about sin not because he was trying to weigh us down on the issue, but because he wanted us to have freedom. Because Jesus understands how destructive these things are. And this is the same point that the author of Hebrews is trying to make, that these things will actually slow you down. They will keep you from living this life. Right? So the thing that we need to do is we need to actually get free of these things. We actually have to consciously deal with these things. Right? So the thing is that we look at the struggles that we have and we're saying that I'm just going to deal with it on my own. Right? And sometimes we can, right? Sometimes there are things that we're doing that we just have to decide to stop doing them. Right? There's some things we can do that way. But oftentimes the things that have the deepest hold of us, we need help with. And we should get that help. And so often we think of needing help as a weakness. But the thing to understand is that we were built to be in life together. Right? So supporting one another in our challenges, in our difficulties, is actually a gift. If we have people in our lives that we can do that with. So if we need help, get it, right? If there's trauma that you can't break free from, if you've got some kind of post-traumatic stress, right? Get into a support group. Get in with a professional if you need to, right? If you've got relationship issues, right? See a counselor, right? But, the big ones that get a hold of us, dependencies, right? Alcohol dependencies, drug dependencies, right? Gambling issues, pornography, right? There are 12-step groups for all of those things that will bring you freedom. And if you don't know where there is one, talk to me. I can connect you with one. And one of the ones I just want to touch base on that is a huge growing problem is the growing use of pornography. Statistically, over 50% of Christian men view pornography regularly. And they say it's not harmful. Wrong. Wrong. And if that's something you're struggling with, we actually have direct access to a group that deals with that. It makes a difference. It's worth addressing. But any of these things that have a hold of you, you got to get into a support environment. Take those steps towards healing. Because if you don't deal with them, you're never going to have the life that you were called to live, that you were created to live. That we shouldn't be weighed down. We shouldn't accept that. We all deal with it. We all run into it. We all find ourselves stuck in a hole. But don't choose to stay there. If we don't choose to address it, we're choosing to stay there. So let's get that help, get that support. And the thing that we want to do is that if we're going to run this life, and run this race, and have this life like the authors describe, we've got to pursue personal wellness, breaking free of those things that have a hold of us, and breaking free of those habits that do so much damage. And then continue with what the author of Hebrews has to say. He says, and let us run with endurance the race God has set out before us. And he makes this point that race is long, right? It is not a sprint. It is a long distance run. So you got to be healthy in it. So you got to do the things that let you keep running the race, let you to be present in it, right? And that being healthy and pursuing healing are just part of the journey, but it's what will make the journey possible for you. And then he goes on to say, we do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Notice what he's saying there. Run the race that God has set before us by keeping our eyes on Jesus. Recognizing that the journey is long, and it's a journey of purpose. And the way we find that purpose is by keeping our eyes on Jesus. Right? And if you remember what we read last week from the Apostle Paul, in the book of Ephesians, Paul makes that exact same point. That you were created on purpose with a purpose, right? To live out the life that Jesus calls you into, to do the sort of good in this world that we are intended to do. And we find that by keeping our eyes on Jesus. So the things that I want to really, really help us to see as I close here is that most of us are not living the life that we were created to live, right? Most of us are either caught in just trying to get through or finding ourselves in a daily grind. And the way out of that is often not the things we choose. Trying to escape, trying to get through, right? Just muscling through, pretending we're okay when we're not okay. Those things are not going to lead you to that fullness of life. That fullness of life is found by leaning into the gifts that we are given, right? That you were created very specifically as who you are. Your life experiences have enabled you to do things in a way that no one else will ever do them. And that's all part of your purpose. And I know that sometimes it's really a struggle to find your purpose. I struggled for many years in that. But if we incorporate the kind of practices where we're connecting and engaging with God daily, and we're active in doing the good that we can do and investing in each other's lives and keeping our eyes on Jesus, that will be revealed. And it may take a few tries to find just where you fit and where you belong, but even in that, the journey will tune you to do the things you were called to do. But you were created to live a life that is satisfying and impactful, that makes a difference. That makes a difference in the lives of people living every day, that makes a difference in the eternities of people that you encounter. And we are in our fullest version of our lives when we are investing in both of those things and trusting that it really is real, that you have a purpose. But you only find it when you're willing to step into it and when you're willing to, as the authors say, be disciplined in how we spend our time to grow and prepare ourselves for that journey. Please be willing to step into that. Start with something as simple as what I spelled out this morning. Right? Read a short scripture, a short prayer, be quiet for 5 minutes. Maybe that last part's the hardest part. Right? But be quiet and consciously present for 5 minutes. It'll make a difference.